Good evening, everybody. My name is Godela Weiss-Sussex. I'm the convener for German Studies at the Institute of Languages, Cultures and Societies here in Central House. And I just want to extend a very warm welcome to you all to this lecture this evening, which I think is the 9th Martin Miller and Hannah Norbert Miller Memorial Lecture. These Miller Lectures are organized on behalf of the Research Center for Austrian and German Exile Studies. And the Research Center actually is celebrating its 30th year this year, its 30th anniversary. So going really, really strong, very, very well. So the center is affiliated to the Institute of Languages, Cultures and Societies, and it's not just affiliated to us, but it's also really a very important part of what we do. And so I want to thank the members of the Research Center, all of them, for their work in research, in archiving, and also in public engagement. Because what they do is important. It's really important in making sure that we remember the contributions that German-speaking exiles made to this country, still making to this country. But we remember this and carry that knowledge. The Institute as a whole is very much focused on research, not only our own research, but on promoting and amplifying research across the country that is vaguely or broadly to do with modern languages. But of course, when you talk about modern languages, you also have to talk about societal issues, about history of art. You know, it all sort of blends in because the cultural study is what is the background to everything else, really. So what we concentrate on is research that makes us get out of the old grooves, research that makes us think anew. So we concentrate on new voices, but also on remembering voices that may have been forgotten, unjustly forgotten. And the work of the Research Center goes very much exactly in that direction. And then today's speaker, Griselda Pollock, is of course an exemplary researcher in exactly that vein and changing the discourse and making us think anew and in reminding us of figures that we should remember more strongly. So I am really, really delighted to introduce our speaker tonight. Griselda Pollock is an emerita professor at the University of Leeds. She's been working in art history, but not only in art history, very much also in cultural memory more broadly. She has worked her whole career, I think, she's been working on feminist perspectives, on making women more visible in the arts, but also in the discipline of art history. And it is just a couple of titles that she's published that I want to mention here. One is, or two, are the collected volumes she edited with Mark Silverman, Concentrationary Memory and Concentrationary Art. And the other one I have to mention is the book on Charlotte Salomon, which probably many of you know, which came out in 2018 and really has, I think, put Charlotte Salomon on the map for people who didn't know her before. So I'm delighted you're here. Very warm welcome. Before I give the floor to you, though, I think Anthony Grenville, the director of the Research Center, also wants to say a few.
Thank you very much, Godela. I'm the chair of I'm Anthony Grenville, as Godela has just said, the chair of the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies. And on behalf of the Research Centre, I'd like to welcome you all very much here this evening. It is, of course, a great pleasure and privilege to be able to welcome someone as eminent as Professor Griselda Pollock, and I'm sure we're all very much looking forward to hearing her speak. I should also say that these lectures are due to the generosity of Daniel Miller, the son of Martin Miller and Hannah Norbert Miller, who has made these lectures and a whole lot of the research centre's activities possible. And we thank you, Daniel, very much indeed. Now, I have a personal reason for thanking Griselda Pollock, because when I saw that title, my heart leapt. I have researched for years on the Association of Jewish Refugees, and amongst the people whose names I came across frequently, the first issue of the AJR Information, now AJR Journal, appeared in January 1946, and it's been appearing monthly ever since. I won't say anything about Helen Rosenau, who I knew nothing about until I saw her name in the AJR Information. But I will say something about Lutz, who I also knew nothing about. And I imagine very few people in the audience do either. Though, as I went every week to the offices of the AJR, which then the Association of Jewish Refugees, which then used to be off Finchley Road, and read my way through one issue and took notes, I began to feel as if I almost knew some of the people who wrote civilized, highly cultured German and Austrian refugees. Lutz, who seemed to know everybody who was anybody in pre-1933 literary circles. Walter, Ernst Schäfer, other names that are only familiar to people who have researched the AJR. But in my opinion, it's people like that, these highly civilized, as I've said, highly cultured Jewish refugees who provided the sort of high plateau from which the peaks, like, for example, Helen Rosenau and the other well-known art historians, plus all the others, emerged. People who brought from Germany and Austria the tradition of almost, one might say, veneration for education and culture, that was really a hallmark of German-speaking Jewry in Central Europe in the pre-Hitler years. And I'd just like to say a little about 2 points of their career in this country, how they arrived, and a little bit about how they settled. The great majority of the refugees, and there were over 70,000 of them that came to Britain, arrived in the last 18 months after the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany in March 1930. And of course, the notorious so-called Kristallnacht pogrom of November 1938. In the previous 5 years, after the assumption of power by the Nazis in January 1933, at most about 10,000 refugees had come to this country, so about 2,000 a year. That means that the remaining, getting on for 60,000, came in the last 18 months at a rate of well over 3,000 a month. How did they come? They came because they got visas. How did you get a visa? You got a visa mainly if you found someone to sponsor you. That is to say, to put up a guarantee of £50, then quite a considerable amount of money. Who was this likely to benefit? Not so much the poor Orthodox Jews in areas like Vienna's Leopoldstadt or the Scheinenviertel in Berlin, but more the middle class, educated, cultivated, more internationally minded Jews, people who might have personal contacts in this country or business contacts, like my father did, who came here on a visa with my mother and got 11 people out because his business contacts, our family firm in Vienna, had the Dunhill agency for Austria. He found people who would guarantee for them. So this was the way that people got into this country. And as I'm trying to point out, the system benefited the middle class educated people to the disadvantage, it must be said, of those who were less internationally minded, less familiar with international travel, did not have passports, did not have much money, were Yiddish speaking rather than German speaking with some knowledge of English. As a result, the community that came and settled here was, not entirely, of course, but largely, to a much larger extent than the native British population, middle class rather than working class. I always remember when I came across an interview with a man called Richard Hyman, who settled in Harrogate in Yorkshire and became a milkman. And he was regarded as something of a curiosity amongst the local refugee community for that very reason. It was known as Dick the Milk. When I was looking at the residence patterns of AJR members in the decades of settlement, it's very noticeable that they lived in middle-class areas. Hampstead, most obviously, the principal area of settlement was northwest London. Hampstead, Belsize Park, Swiss Cottage, West Hampstead, Golders Green to some extent. If you were lucky, St John's Wood, Willesden Green, Maida Vale. But as soon as you went, say, west from West Hampstead towards the Edgware Road into Kilburn, the number of addresses dropped off sharply. Likewise, if you went south from Belsize Park towards Camden Town, it did the same. This is before gentrification. And for that reason, amongst others, I think that our community had a relatively smooth entree into this country compared to other groups. They settled largely in middle-class areas and went into largely, not entirely, of course, middle-class professions, thereby avoiding competition for accommodation and employment with the working-class people, and avoided reactions like we saw in the riots last summer, anti-immigrant riots, and as we're seeing at the moment in deprived areas of Northern Ireland. In Hampstead itself, which I'll just talk about for a moment, there was anti-immigrant feeling, and there was indeed in autumn of 1945 an anti-alien petition demanding the forcible repatriation of aliens, which is what non-British residents were called, principally, of course, Jewish refugees. That attracted initially some support, but then collapsed. However, in Hampstead, there was a concentration of people on whom Oswald Mosley could and did concentrate. Not only Jews, but German Jews. And Mosley campaigned fairly vigorously in Hampstead. There were Mosleyite meetings by the Whitestone Pond in Hampstead and a police presence. However, at the LCC, London County Council, local government elections in 1949, Mosley's union movement secured 81 votes out of 25,000. By my maths, about 0.3%, and that was the end of that. As a result, I think it's not unfair to say that the refugees who settled in Hampstead and that sort of area integrated reasonably well. I lost count long ago of the number of refugees who I heard or read saying, yes, I've settled. I shall never be English, but British. Not English, but British. And I think that's probably fair comment. As I've said, I think this was the sort of seedbed from which the greater figures then emerged. And now we're going to hear about one of them. So I'll hand over to Griselda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very useful framing of the talk I'm about to give. Actually, Helen Rosenau's ambition, according to Adrian Rifkin, was the one thing she wanted to do was to have a flat in Bloomsbury. So she's lonely, lived all over the place, but anyway. So I am incredibly honoured, and thank you, Anthony, for the introduction to this proposal to give the Martin Miller and Hannah Norbert Miller Memorial Lecture here tonight. Always when we are honouring those who not only support memory, but in a sense made such an impact in Britain, it's difficult to stand in the place of people who've done this. But I hope by honouring the wonderful Helen Rosenau, who's been looking down at you, she, as Rachel Dixon, who was one of the co-authors of one of the books that we've published, pointed out, when I first lectured on Helen Rosenau, there were no photographs of her in the public domain. So that's why all the photographs now come from her son, Michael Carney, has preserved her method for her. But I love this photograph particularly because she's a woman after my own heart. I don't wear fur, but she obviously had a sense of jewelry and style. I think that's what women often have. So my title comes from Lutz Weltman, writing in the AJR, as we will see as it goes along. So we have to do this one. Here we are. Okay, and I'm proposing that the fact that Helen Rosenau became a founder of Jewish studies in Britain, not just biblical theological studies, but something comparable to what we call cultural Jewish studies and feminist studies, long before my generation woke up to this idea, that her work was anti-fascist defiance. And I thought this is important because while you've given us a picture of people who happily settled in Hampstead and lived their nice lives and went to Belsize Synagogue and other things like that, Helen was a socialist, a radical thinking political person whose response to the horrors that she had escaped was to defy in many critical ways the fascism that had led to her forced exile, but also those of us who are feminists are internal exiles in patriarchal phallocentric society, and many of the other exiles did not embrace women in the same way that we hope they had. So in preparation for this talk, I took myself to Frankfurt, which meant breaking my rules about flying. I've given up flying because of preserving the world that is going to disintegrate without me, but I don't want to add on. And this is just a picture of some of the files that I found in the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt. Now, why are they in the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt? I will explain in a moment, but I'm just going to give you another sense that of these lovely photographs that Michael and Louise Carmi have made available to me, stressing this question of what we can get rid of this thing. Oh, I hate to do that, but you will miss out on this. A Jewish feminist socialist intellectual in exile in Britain, And I think we need to understand what to be in exile is. It's not just to immigrate, and that's why I don't use the word emigre, because it wasn't voluntary. It was to lose everything that had been your life. But also she was an exile in the art historical community of the German and Austrian exiles and the male historians. I think this is very important. Some people just got on fine. Many people had their knighthoods to confirm their place in British society. But Helen Rosenau had a very tough time getting jobs, getting the means of working, and she only eventually got a full-time post in 1951. But I love these photographs of this dashing young, beautiful woman with a whole future ahead of her, a distinguished woman in her great, as it were, her prime, in a kind of Miss Jean Bury, she's definitely in her prime. And then this wonderful image of a person in graceful and still luminous old age. Now, back to the files. They are in the Jewish Museum because Gustav Metzger, some of you will know about Gustav Metzger, one of the great radical artists of the 20th century. Very fascinating. Never had to send him a letter and say, would you please be in the phone box across the way from where you lived? A very radical thinker. But his brother was Mendel Metzger and his sister-in-law, Therese Metzger, who were art historians and special studies. So I'm assume something more about that I'm finding it follows. And Gustav arrived stateless in Britain with his brother in 1939, and he came just to be, how did they come here? Through the Kinder transport. But for reasons which we're still trying to work out, he carried off the archives from Michael and his family and took them, we thought, to the Exile archive, which is an archive in Frankfurt, but they are in the Jewish Museum. And the Jewish Museum doesn't know why it has it, so I'm hoping somebody at the result of this talk will say, let's get them back in Britain, because she became a British art historian, maybe not an English one, but she was a historian. Now, in that archive, I found this profile of her, which shows that, sorry, I would like somebody to get rid of that one. But anyway, 51 to 68, she was a lecturer and what we call an associate professor at Manchester. But this is a Manchester, a profile in the Manchester paper. And I want to draw your attention to a number of things. This lovely quotation that art historians have been called a continental disease. The history of art is a very serious study, and I'm pleased to say the disease is spreading. But in England, unfortunately, art appreciation is all too often superficial, gushing and elementary, and with very little knowledge of the history of art. There's no basis for an informed criticism. So she represents the transformation of art history from a kind of jolly, Roger Fry, Burlington Magazine, oh, how lovely, serious people, I can't knock them down, etc. But there was no art history as a form of discipline in the way there was German universities and indeed French universities. So the exiles brought that with them, brought this, what might call disease. And Helen Rosenau is one of the most important figures, but it is horrifying that probably you didn't know that. You probably heard of many of the boys, some of whom became household names in Britain, but very few of the women, and there are others. But this leads to the second quotation. Dr. Rosenau has strong views on the place of women in society. She believes not only in equality of opportunity, but that the educated wife and mother, with interests of her own, can enrich family life just as much as the life of the nation. Now, that's a really, really important claim for the right to women to have education, to have jobs, and also to have families, because the whole usual thing is you either have one or the other, or you're sacrificing your children to work. And when I got a scholarship, I came top of my MA, sorry, it's going to brag a little bit, but I got the highest mark in my MA at the Cultural and was therefore allowed to apply for and got a scholarship to do a PhD. I was told indirectly by Anthony Blunt, because he wouldn't talk directly to women, that I should keep this up because I would surely waste it, because I'd go off, get married, and have children. So unfortunately, my children have been totally sacrificed to my refusal to have that as my faith. Love this aspect. She says, however, that social adjustments are well worth making because women should have the conditions for this, and I have a great feeling of solidarity with all women, even though they're still frequently shy and repressed and do not make full use of opportunities. And that's an also important sense, because it's quite difficult to push against a whole society's systems. Anyway, so you've got an idea here. So now we come to the AGR Journal and the Forgotten Voice, which is a lovely article by Grenville, restoring Lutz Weltman to his place as a kind of carrier of a great intellectual and cultural tradition, which he brought across, particularly about theatre. And here he writes a review of Helen Rosenau's book from 1948, a book on the French revolutionary painter Jean-Louis David in 1948. And here in the archive is Helen's cutting of it with marked up, because she was so pleased to have this review. So we're going to study this review a bit, and I'm very helpful. Take it out. Dr. Helen Rosenau has built up a fine reputation as an art historian in this country through lectures and books, but her special subject is architecture, and her heart belongs to Jewish and women's questions. So that's where I get this line for this. What does it mean for your heart? You have a reputation, you're a great scholar, but do we usually ask, where is your heart when you do this work? What is nowadays they say, is feminist studies your passion? No, I'm going to go with heart. I think it's a much stronger word, etc. So I wanted to bring it up. So the reason I'm working on Helen Rosenau is because of somebody you can't see here, but that's a lovely portrait of the brilliant and wonderful Adrian Rivkin, who was one of Helen Rosenau's students, not an official student, but he was the one who mentored him into his art history and into his PhD, and sent him actually off to Leeds to do his PhD with a friend called Arnold Nowak. But I was writing a big bibliography of women in the history of art, and as art historians, and women in the history of art as topics and as artists. And Adrian Carsley said to me, don't forget the little book by Helen Rosenau. And I thought, well, it's very difficult to forget a book that I probably never come across. So off I went, age of the internet, ordered it, found it. And with Rachel Dixon, who's here, and Adrian, we took it on to make this much better known. So this is the little book. It's literally a little book, right? It is 1944. She was doing it with Karl Mannheim, not at the Courtauld, but at the LSE with a whole group of other feminist sociologists who were his students at the time. Pages, 55 illustrations, cost about £8 at the time, black and white, made literally, in the very dark years of the end of the war. In 2024, we managed to produce a very big book, right? I'll tell you how big it is, 388 pages, which is cheap, given how much it is. And I'm sure it must be 139 illustrations, but this reproduces the book completely in the middle of the book. And then there is an essay a memoir by Adrian, a very beautiful biographical essay by the newly Dr. Rachel Dixon, and an enormous amount of 60,000 words that I wrote to interpret the significance and meaning of the little book, to put it in context, to situate her, and to produce a really deep understanding of the intellectual, the sociological, the philosophical, the historical brilliance with which she produced a book, not about women in art, not about women artists in art, but the concept of woman as we trace it across history from 33,000 years before us, because it is the antidote for all its smallness to this nefarious book. It could be written 6 years after she wrote her book, erase every single woman and erase every question about gender or class or race or any of the issues. But it's nefarious because it sold 8 million copies. It's gone into 17 editions and is in more than 30 languages. So for most people post-war, the history of art is taught to them by this writing. Now, this writing, by its exclusions, I'm going to say, is proto-fascist. And it's important we understand that, because it's a certain kind of legacy. Now, if we assemble some of these diseased disease carriers, the great exile art historians that came to Britain, including Gombrich, Rudolf Wittgewer, the great architectural historian, Fritz Saxel, who was the assistant bringing the kind of Warburg Institute, Edgar Witt, who became a professor at Oxford, Nicholas Pesner, famous for his Bodybuilders of England and BBC publications. Ettlinger became a professor at UCL. I'm sorry, we don't have a picture of him that I could find. But these others, Arnold Hauser, Friedrich Antal, Max Raphael, and come back to those in a minute, Helen Rosenau, I've put in red because these are what Harry Anderson calls the red migration. These are the radicals. These are the Marxists. These are the thinkers who are not embraced by the ultimately very conservative English establishment. And Gertrude Bing and Stella Kramisch are probably as unknown to you. Perhaps if you were anything to do with art history, you knows these. But Gertrude Bing came with the Warburg Library and was not a feminist. But Stella Kramrisch, who recently been reinstated, was a professor of Indian art. She was appointed as the first professor of Indian art in Calcutta, in Bengal, in the 30s. She taught at the Courtauld in the 1930s as well. So we're trying to restore this picture of who the exiles were. Let me tell you a little bit more about, it's clinging, Helen Rosenau, because she was born in Monte Carlo, which seems perfectly exotic for the kind of person she was, but that's because her father was a doctor who worked in the spa in Bad Kissingen, because Bad Kissingen means it's a spa town, but in the winter he went and looked after the rest of their cures in Monte Carlo. So she was born in Monte Carlo, but raised in Bad Kissingen, educated privately in Germany, and we'll see her university education. She came to Britain via Switzerland and arrived in the autumn of 1933 because her scholarship was suspended by the very first law that the National Socialists passed. She became associate professor at the University of Manchester, but also retired. She is a powerhouse teaching all over London, different areas where she could teach, but she taught to the Leo Baeck College. She trained a generation of rabbis in the liberal and progressive movement, but also at the Royal Institute of Architects, British Architects, Polytech Central and WEA, and all sorts of evening classes. So she is stretching herself between university education and reaching out to new areas of education. Her father was a doctor, was in the Bavarian Military Medical Corps. We have a sent to his daughter, which is preserved. You can see him there. Her mother, Clara Leon Rosenau, fled with her daughter to Britain, but very interestingly returned to Germany in 1935 to Baden-Baden, and perhaps Anthony could tell me more about why that might be. Helen Rosenau applied regularly to go and see her mother, but was refused by the German authorities because she was classified as subversive. So they wouldn't even let her in the 30s. But it's good to tell you that Clara Leon Rosenau died naturally in 1940 and is buried in her hometown. Okay. Now, Helen Rosenau's education as an art historian is phenomenal because while these nice old photographs may look boring to you, these are the Mr. and Mrs. Biggs of German art history in classical and medieval studies, which was what you had to study. There wasn't yet a modern art to study, but you went, including the second woman to be a professor in Germany who came to Britain, Margarete Bieber, who was an honorary fellow at Somerville for a while in Oxford, but actually then got a post at Barnard College, which is the women's version of Columbia University, where she was much reputed. But Paul Clement and Goldschmidt, these are names that you'll find as the teachers of the great generation that I just showed you before. So she, and this, I love this beautiful thing that Louisa and Mike showed me. This is the certificate of her doctorate. But what you might see is she got a doctorate in philosophy, which obviously you do, but her title is Der Kölner Dom, Cologne Cathedral. So not a lot of Jewish studies here yet, okay? But she's at the University of Hamburg, which is newly founded in 1919. So a radical new for the big Hanseatic merchant town rather than one of the kind of classic universities from medieval times. But she is there at the point which the Warburg Institute or the Warburg Library is installed, the KBW, the Kulturwissenschaftliches Bibliothek Warburg, KB, you see it there, which is this remarkable place where Warburg believed in the good neighborliness of all the subjects. So an art history, like I think, had to have obviously art history books, but classics, theology, philosophy, philology. And that's where the circular library is the idea that you didn't have sections, that they're all talking to each other, but also it was under the concept of memory, mnemosine, you could practice your Greek here. Use it not. But the key thing that the Warburgs introduce into art history, or Arbivog, is the idea that art is a form of cultural memory, not a history of styles, not a history of great geniuses, not a history of national brilliance. It's a form of human cultural memory that is passed on through two things. One is turning, what she called symbolic thought, turning the things into life into something you can think, right? Like birth and death. That is turning what happens in life into something that you have a word for, that you can think about. But also the image as a carrier of affect, a way of conveying anxiety, fear, distress, depression, rage, fury, hurt. Right? So when we're looking at art, we're not saying, isn't it beautiful? And isn't it lovely? And look how brilliant Michelangelo is. You're looking at the struggle to find a form that can make visible concepts and ideas, but also affects that give the power to this. So this is a crucial sense of where she is formed. So we come back to our friend LW, and what he's reviewing here is her book on David, the first book on a revolutionary French painter, so putting her political cards on the table in English. Absolutely the beginning. Now David is endless, big exhibitions, Paris, he's taken up wonderful, but she restores to him some sense. This little book, Woman in Art, and the other book she produces in 1948 is A History of Jewish Art, which is one of the first kind of small studies. And I want you to look at these covers, very important. So in this, she's telling us a story that woman has a presence as an idea across all of art, but there's a change from the ancient world, which sees her as a type, to the modern 20th century. So she's going beyond classical and medieval, because this is a work, the oldest work, one of the oldest works in the world, probably made by a woman, of woman. The Willendorf figure, she's not a Venus, it's that size, you can hold it in your hand, very interesting. And this is a work from 1937 by Barbara Hepworth. Barbara Hepworth doing her first abstract works of art, exhibition Helen Rosenau went to, reviewed, talked about, and is in correspondence with this very young Barbara Hepworth, who hasn't yet become the kind of icon of British sculpture that she later became. But if we go to the cover of this, you can see the range of what she's calling Jewish art. It's not just contemporary Jewish artists or abstract expressionists. We've got Dura Europos Synagogue. Now, one thing is that was only excavated in the 1930s because the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, the Treaty of Versailles, meant the British and the French divided up the former Ottoman Empire and created what we know as the Mandate of Palestine. And then the French got the mandate of Syria and Lebanon. Okay. So that was just discovered. And what they found when they excavated the synagogue from the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era is paintings. Now, all of you have probably been taught Jewish people you're not allowed images, okay? I'm afraid to say they're there. But what you've got here, if this had a thing I point out, what your painting is showing, maybe that is, yes, there you are, there, is the memory of the temple, right? The preservation of some kind of visual memory, mostly which people know from endlessly reading through the cycle of the Torah. You listen to the description of the building of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, and what was in it, and there I'll show you, but it's the candelabra, it's the sort of the niche which holds the scrolls, which holds the ark, etc. And then we've got pictures. Then we've got a portrait by Albert of Ambassador by Jacob Epstein, so 1933, very contemporary. An 18th century tombstone. Where else would you find Jewish art but in sculpture in all the cemeteries of the world? This is actually a Roman period synagogue in Tunisia. This is the decorative floor, which they think so shows the world of creation. And this is a synagogue. I don't think it is the Godela, but that's what she put in the book, but in some sense, a relatively recent form of contemporary Jewish architecture. So this is looks like a very simple book, but it's denying the notion that Jewish thought and Jewish culture didn't produce a visual history, of art history. So when we put on the whole books that we can see, here is her thesis, the Cologne. Then she does a second thesis on another cathedral in Bremen, which is interrupted. Then she did a third PhD, because the first, second, because in Germany you have to be allowed to teach. So she has to have two to think of herself as a professor. So she goes to the newly founded quarter. And what does she do it on but the history of the synagogue? So remember, 1932, the Duro Europos. She's now beginning to see that there is a deeper cultural, architectural history in Jewish thought and life, which must take on the synagogue, and it's very pertinent. So that's going to go into the Jewish art. There's your David. Then she specializes for most of her professional life in ideal architecture, ways that people thought ideas through architecture, like the ideal city or the possibility of, in the neoclassical period, of completely getting rid of the old medieval messy cities and having planned worlds with classical order. His visionary art. And then her final book is the history of the temple, the vision of the temple, the memory of the temple in both of the Temple of Jerusalem, in both Judaism and Christianity. So she's found this kind of central image. Now, this will make sense of various things. The book she was sort of working on, and we found parts of that in the archive now, is Rembrandt and the Jews. She's going to claim Rembrandt as an important part of the history of Jewish art. Now, that's a puzzle. I'll leave you for the moment. Okay. She's a prolific author, articles and books. But what does it mean? It means that by 1948, she has already created the fields of Jewish studies and feminist studies. But if we go back to Lutz, Weltman, the Jewish question and the woman question, this is chilling, right? The Jewish question is not something Jewish people talk about or think about themselves. They don't have a question, okay? Your Jewish question is always non-Jewish people having a question about what are we going to do about the Jews, okay? And the woman question are not simple. They're matters of life and death. So what does it mean that her heart belongs to these? Is the heart the seat of love? Or in Jewish thought, the heart is where you think. You love the Lord your God with all your heart, not because you're, oh, he's such a lovely God and loving. It's a matter of every part of you must come together to perform this act of love as a kind of an act of intellect, an act of politics, an act of devotion. So we take the woman question and we go through the two. The Jewish question comes up in questions of emancipation, first posed in Britain, and should we make Jews citizens? They pass the law and then they repeal it a year later, so that's not very good. France poses la question juive as part of the revolutionary. Can we emancipate the Jews? They did, but not in kind of accept. Germany, the Judenfrage gets posed in the beginning of what is fundamentally the anti-Semitic turn in German thought. And even Marx, when it's called, should you have freedom from religion, as opposed to being defined as a religious group, it must be a civil group, Marx responded with a wonderful anti-Semitism, which is to say, until they're emancipated from capitalism, the Jews will never be free, because he identifies the Jews with capitalism. So you get National Socialism, you then racialize the people you make non-citizens and you proceed from emancipation to de-emancipation and total. So engagement with the Jewish question is a profound one, and indeed this is the RSH Reich Security Main Office booklet, which I think Rachel found, and I'm grateful to her for that, which produces a list of all the Jewish exiles, these wonderful exiles that you would come in their 60,000 by the beginning of this period of the 1940, who are listed one by one, name by name, to be arrested and deported once the German forces conquer Britain, which they were confident they would do in September 1914. Okay, so this is a matter of life and death. And the Jew, Helen Rosenau is very much recognized already by 1951 as a Jewish scholar. And this is a request to her to find out if the Jews have had any role in art. And this is her reply, but she's being asked all these questions. She's publishing about Jews. And the last letter that I found in the things, she says, my next book is Judaism and the Arts. So this is a profound continuity in her writing, contacting Thames of Hudson. And Mr. Nichols is obviously the editor at Yale University Press, who also turned down my PhD. So I'm glad to get her books. And she's teaching this in all sorts of areas, particularly in rabbinic training. And this one I thought was this question of religion and the visual arts with special reference to Judaism. So she's taking this across the different categories, not just in art history, writing for the Encyclopedia Judaica. Here's her entry on Abraham. And she's teaching in schools. So this is a remarkable woman in every possible way of spreading all of this. And this is an interesting letter from Rabbi John Rayner, the liberal rabbi, the head of the liberal movement at the time, 1968, saying, we can't promise you to do a course on Jewish art in rabbinic training. Now, that's, I think, a completely forgotten area of asking the rabbinic students to think about teaching Judaism in a much more expanded way, including the ways in which Jewish art might help them. So we go on and on. Okay, and here's this little thing that I found this, which is so interesting, about at present assimilation and integration of topical political subjects. Rembrandt did both. He assimilated creatively what he desired while remaining himself, integrating not only the Jewish but also the classical heritage in his novel creations. And her main point about Rembrandt is that he chose to live in the Jewish community in Amsterdam. This was not in the ghetto, it's the most prosperous part of Amsterdam. Right? Even though he's lost all his money, he moves to this. And her major point is that the greatest exponent of biblical representation was a non-Jew, Rembrandt, who voluntarily lived amongst the Jews in Amberside, using his transcending powers of psychological insight to reveal the fullest meaning of his subject, which he does by drawing his biblical works from living Jewish models. He's living amongst Jewish models, we don't want to go about that one, etc., because he is engaged directly, living amongst and watching the Jewish world in its way. So it's not a type, it's not a stereotype, it's actually living and speaking with and asking them to model, because of course he's painting images, printing images of rabbis, of Pharisees, and of Yehoshua ben Yosef ben Miriam, otherwise known as Jesus. Right? Now, when we come to the woman's question, there are similar questions to the right to life, to education, to emancipation, to income, to choices, and to life itself, because even though the majority of the history of the posing of the question of women from the 15th century through to the revolutionary period in France, through to the mid-20th century with Simone de Beauvoir, and to the post-68 feminist movement, people forget that we are dealing with what is now named femicide. The statistics are so horrifying, right? Globally, 80,000 women are killed in 2021 by the UN 56% of them died by partners or family members, right? Every single day, 137 women are killed by a family member, according to the 2000 census. And every 40 minutes worldwide, a woman are killed by someone she knows. So although it might look trivial to say on the basis of those, the final solution to the Jewish question with the mass genocidal murder, we are forgetting these statistics. And this is why it's so important she brought these two things together, because of course, in terms of fascism, in terms of the long history of modernity that's going to lead to fascism, who are denied human rights to life, Jewish community, but who are denied human rights to all the things that the women's question had posed, the right to choice. And she puts into her essay on women under the to women under the swastika in 1942, this lovely set of commandments created by a German philosopher Schlegel under the influence of his wife. This is a new set of the 10 Commandments. You shall not have you shall have no other lover beside him, but you should be able to have a friend without flirting, be coquettish without succumbing. You shall not make thyself an ideal, an angel in heaven, or a hero out of a poem, but you must love somebody as he is in reality. You must not misuse the small tokens of love. You must listen to the Sabbath of your heart. But these are ones, honor the individuality of a children. You must not create life unintentionally. You shall not conclude a marriage which could be broken. You shall not want to be loved when you do not love. You shall not bear false witness for the men, and you shall not long, and that you shall long for men's culture, art, wisdom, and honor. You want the education. You want to be part of it. So she's honoring Rachel Levin van Hagen and Dorothea von Schlegen, and she says it's timely to remember that there here speaks a German tradition which was alive in German feminist movement, a tradition overshadowed by recent events, but which will rise again. So she's also bringing a much longer set of from 18th century Enlightenment thinking, and she's going to then pick up on the present. And in her essay on the Barbara Hepworth exhibition in '68, she says here, a last word, there is still a stereotype of the feminine and of women's art. And she values the work of Barbara Hepworth for attempting to transform that while remaining true to herself. So I think I'm just going to get past these things, which are just to remind you, her thing comes out of the Leeds community with Panofsky, who was her supervisor for her thesis, of Abi Warburg, who's part there, and these two men. And in this lovely book by Emily J. Levine about the Hamburg school and their brilliance, I'm going to blot out, I'm afraid, Max Warburg and say she belongs in this pantheon. She is a thinker of the same order of origination, of ways of understanding the significance of these two kind of sites of alterity, these othered people who should be, as it were, not othered but included. And that's part of my purpose. They wrote these books, and woman as art is of the same order, but because it was in the war, there wasn't a lot of paper, so it's a much shorter book. I just want to say two final things, if you can bear this, because you're probably dying for a drink, but I have to explain why she did a thesis on cathedrals. You can bear with me. So these look very Gothic to you, and you think, oh, these are great Christian cathedrals. Cologne is very interesting. It took 632 years to be completed. When it was completed in 1880, it was the tallest building in the world so far. But what she's interested in is none of this. None of this. She's interested in the ground plan. That's why she becomes an archaeologist, because she has to see, the first thing you see is, what have they started to build as a ground plan? It's you thinking, my BA not here tonight, but you see how interesting this is. So what you're seeing here is buildings that have a longitude, and then this one, obviously, you have an apse here, and something very special happens in here, right? They're all buildings that you enter, and you walk through, and there's something at the end that is your destination. Ground plans. Now, the Christians obviously add crosses. They add little side bits because they want, that's their symbolic form to make it look like that. But the central thing is a longitudinal orientation towards a central point. She goes on to look at Bremen. She digs up Bremen. That doesn't have a cross yet, you see. It's the same thing. And this one is in Zurich. Because, of course, what they are repeating is the descriptions in Exodus for building the tabernacle. The core memory of all these buildings is how would you create a sort of a sacred space to meet non-human. That's the point, because the building of the tabernacle is because every so often the cloud comes down and they say the Lord dwells there, and the memory of the Lord's coming down and telling you what is in the Ark of the Covenant, which has the scrolls in it. And then you have a very secret place where they're kept and a special altar. And then you have a curtain, so that's called the Holy of Holies. And then you have the altar for all this other sacrifices, but it is enter, and there's a passage, and then there's the sacrificial altar, and then this other place. And that, of course, is what we think she was digging for. It was celebrated when, like 1974, she went back and she said how thrilled she was because she'd fallen in love with the cathedral and she was delighted to come back. But I want to get to the fact that where she is going to end up is studying synagogues to see how do they reproduce the structure with the niche with scrolls. And that's, these synagogues are not processional, but you always have that focus point. How do they have a memory of the temple? And how does this actually lead us? Here's her visiting this Damascus Palace Hotel. You can see she drew from herself, she's drawing ground plans of what she thinks. She's looking at these other forms of archaeology that's coming out of that right at the moment where synagogues in Germany are being destroyed, including her own, Berlin. But she's going to link this with the study of women artists. I'm hurrying, I've helped you far too long, and you'll see this, I can read the wonderful book. But she's a member of the Fabian Society. She's a member of the Artists' Union. Mary Kelly was the first chair of the Artists' Union, which was founded in 1972. She's involved with all the radicals in the contemporary art world, and she's even going to be advising the Labour Party on art, having a Labour policy on the arts, the significance of the arts, which is a radical element of this. I love this little one that printers were bombed in. We only got 1,000 copies of this because of that bombing. I just was so delighted. She tries to get her book published again, and she goes to all sorts of people. It's going too long, but I want to get to this, etc. So when we get to her final book, we can trace it all the way through these books back to her architectural studies, at side by side with the idea of how is woman being thought through the history of art. Is in sense, how has this notion of a sacred space of meeting been thought, and how does the memory of the temple in Jerusalem, Solomon's temple, Zerubbabel's design for one, the Herodian temple, and as we all know, it's the destruction of the Herodian temple by the Romans in 70 AD, which leads to the expulsion of the Jews from Judea and the renaming of the territory that had been Judea as the land of the Philistines. Because Palestina is the Latin version of the name for the Philistines. Not the Philistines who are ignorant, but the Philistines who lived on, who were the other people, the other Semitic people. And her final book on the temple is this notion that this is a symbolic form that has maintained its power to charge the imagination of building from all the way through the through into the Christian terms and into modern synagogic structure. And she suggests at the end of her study of the ways in which the memory of this temple has resonated and been recorded and invented and imagined in all its sense of this orientation. And I should say the word orientation means to be looking towards the east, right? And the original, all of the original buildings of any sacred site in the ancient world were oriented towards the east, just like this. So as the sun rose in the east, the light would come in and mark its way down to the central place where the altars or the scrolls were kept or whatever. So which is why all synagogues are now built so that the bimah faces west, and when we are in synagogue, we are always facing east, not to Jerusalem, but from this much, much more ancient, archaic notion of where will the light come from. So this study of the longitudinal, this repeat of this kind of building, because you think, why would a cathedral have this great long nave? You know, we think of a nave and an apse when you do architecture, but it's not, it's a repeat of this particular structure. And she sees that perhaps the most significant site of this memory now is the museum at Yad Vashem, the building of Yad Vashem in an abstract form with all its different parts. So I'm hoping that you've understood this sense of how she studies formal structures of architecture and art, which inspire a pictorial tradition, a kind of endless repetition in different forms, whether they're buildings or images, around these two central elements, right? But what I want to say, just to conclude, because you'll be fascinated by this, etc. But what I think we're witnessing in studying her is an alliance of the heart against fascism in political history and the muted form of it in the version of art history that became received and consolidated and celebrated selectively, that the Gombrichs and the Pevsners, they what we call the white migration, at the price of separating off the red migration, the more political ones, that she is an exile within the art historical world, even within the continental, the refugees, because of this sense of seeing the correlation between the suspension of Jewish life and the diminution of the fullness of the lives of women, the recognition of women as co-humans in a society that will truly give life to all. So I think we are enjoined to love with our whole heart, mind, and soul, but she truly loved through the dedicated scholarship, teaching and writing, by these two elements of Jewish studies and women's studies are closely related in her mind. And we hopefully have shown how they do that symbolically, not by entities like the Jews and women, but because they are ways of thinking life and death and choice and thought. Thank you for your attention.